Hi there, Dan Scott here. I want to show you how I went about painting these glaring highlights bouncing off the water's surface. I took this photo at a place called Prevelly in Perth, Australia. We were staying nearby on the Margaret River, and this was a lookout I came across on a morning run. The light bouncing off the ocean was a blinding and magnificent sight. The highlights on the water are obviously the focal point. They are also the most challenging part to paint. It's not as simple as adding a few dabs of titanium white and calling it a day. I need to somehow convey the light flickering and dancing on the water's surface, in between all the tiny dark accents where you can see the deep blues and greens of the ocean. I start by broadly mapping out the base colors of each area. I break the subject down into segments. This makes the subject much more approachable. For the ocean, I ignore any highlights and intricate details. I simply block in the base color of the ocean, which is a deep blue-green color. This will give me a good and dark foundation to work with. I push the paint around using a medium-sized flat brush, and I keep the paint fairly thin on the surface. The more paint you have on the surface, the harder it becomes to control and manipulate in your favor. I'm a bit more careful with my strokes along the edge that separates land and ocean. I want the land and ocean to be distinct, yet also somewhat connected. So I very gently push the colors together. And I don't mind if the edge is a bit soft. I'll be able to use the highlights later on to make it harder as needed. My plan from here is to gently scumble highlights over the top of the water, leaving some of the deep ocean colors exposed. The highlights breaking over the dark surface should do a good job of conveying the light flickering and dancing across the water. But before I get to work on the highlights, I let the painting dry for about a day or so I can work wet on dry. I find that scumbling highlights tends to be more effective when done over a dry or partially dry surface. When you're working wet on wet, the colors tend to mix a lot more. I start with a flat brush and titanium white mixed with a touch of the blue-green color I used for the ocean. It looks like pure white, but I've actually taken the edge off a fair bit. I don't want to use pure titanium white just yet. I want to save that for only the brightest highlights at the end. I start along the horizon line and then work the brush around the ocean, broadly following the sense of movement and contours of the waves. I want to capture the ocean's movement and nature without getting caught up in the tiny details. So in the back of my mind, I think about the push and pull of the ocean and where the waves are building up and breaking. I let these ideas gently guide my brush. I go easy with how much paint I load on the brush, as I don't want to completely cover the surface with highlights. I also don't reload the brush immediately between strokes. Instead, I keep working the brush around until there's hardly any paint left. This allows me to taper off my strokes and add subtle highlights as needed. If we take a closer look at the reference photo, notice how the highlights are concentrated along this line, then they taper off from there. This is important to pick up in the painting. So with most of my strokes, I start around this middle area, then I taper them off towards the sides. What I'm trying to do here is gradually work my way up to the brightest highlights, but I get a bit reckless and overdo it. Notice how it's starting to look a bit caked on and plastic. It doesn't look natural to me. It also doesn't give me much room to add sharper highlights later in the painting. I keep going in this direction for a while, even though it doesn't feel right. Often in this middle stage of the painting, things will appear wrong until all the parts are in place. But that doesn't seem to be the case here, and it doesn't end up reading any better. So I pick up a palette knife and gently scrape away some of the excess paint. Funnily enough, this is much more in line with what I wanted. Applying paint, then scraping most of it away with a palette knife created the rough, broken colour appearance I was looking for. Sometimes you get lucky in painting and stumble across a good solution to a challenging problem. And when that happens, you just go with it. After scraping away enough of the highlights, I used the palette knife to strengthen the darks on the right-hand side. This area is reflecting less light, and I need to pick up more of those deep blue-green ocean colours. But I need to be careful not to overdo it and mess up the highlights. It's a bit of a careful back and forth between the ocean colours and the highlights as I try to find the right balance. Here you can see I suggest a wave breaking just behind the rocks. These dark accents convey a lot of information and realism, so it's important that I get them right. All I do is pick up a bit of the blue-green colour and dab it into the surface without mixing up or down. I don't need to do much, just a few sharp dark accents in the right spots is all that's needed. Then I start building up the highlights again, this time with a palette knife instead of the flat brush. At least with the knife I can easily scrape away paint if I overstep. I can't do that as easily with a brush. And the knife seems to be more effective in general than the brush for conveying these flickering highlights on the water. I'm careful not to overdo it this time. I'm basically just taking what is already on the surface and trying to consolidate it. Here you can see I pick up a little bit of colour from the highlights around the middle and use it to make a few rough marks on the right-hand side to suggest breaks in the water. The reason I pick up colour from the surface rather than from my palette is that it allows me to scrape in a few details in the wet paint. It also helps me keep the paint around the middle fairly thin and manageable. This is something to keep in mind when you're painting. Perhaps instead of getting more paint from your palette, you can grab it from somewhere else in the painting that has too much of it. I swapped to a large palette knife to clean up the horizon line a bit. The large knife is perfect when you need to paint clean, straight edges like this. I also used this large knife to paint a few rough details in the ocean. I often like to paint tiny details with large knives or brushes as it forces you to stay simple and economical with your strokes. When using tiny brushes, it can be easy to get lost in all the noise and information. I go back to a brush and gently scumble more colour over the top. I don't want to do too much as I'm pretty happy with what's on the surface. I just want to add a bit more detail and complexity. That's pretty much it for the water. As you can see, it's quite an effective approach to start with a dark base colour and then scumble highlights over the top. It was also effective to jump between the brush and palette knife, taking advantage of the different types of marks and characteristics. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. Here's how the painting turned out. I'll upload a time lapse when I get a chance, so you can see the painting process from start to finish. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.